Welcome to Larry the Alchemist, and welcome to another edition of Sabbath Sunday. This is where Darin and I get together with you on a Sunday to talk some Black Sabbath. Darin and I also have a Black Sabbath podcast called Into the Void, a Black Sabbath podcast that you can find on all the streaming services. Make sure you check that out. The topic for today's episode is kind of we're going to have a little conversation about Ozzy. And is Ozzy underrated as a singer? And the reason why we wanted to discuss this is it seems like kind of common that people will maybe not give Ozzy the credit that he may be due for his time in Black Sabbath, his time as a solo artist. The common perception is that somebody else writes Ozzy's lyrics. Therefore, Ozzy, what is he even doing in the band? He's not really contributing to the band. There's kind of a feeling that maybe he's not a vocalist from a technical standpoint of the caliber of Ronnie James Dio or Freddie Mercury or something like that. And that may be true on all these points that I mentioned to varying degrees. But we thought it was important to kind of talk about Ozzy as a singer and what he does bring to the band, whether it's with his unique voice, the tone of his voice, his melody lines, the songwriting, stuff like that. So we kind of felt like, this. So the topic is Ozzy an underappreciated singer? So Darin, what do you think about this? Is Ozzy, does he not get the respect that he deserves for being a vocalist?
Yeah, it's kind of a double-edged sword. I think at this stage that I think that Ozzy's he's a little overrated. I think he's been overrated for the past 30 years. I think ever since his solo career took off, Ozzy definitely became, an iconic figure in heavy metal. Um, in and around, let's say 1982, I mean, his career was taking off and Black Sabbath kind of just leveled
Mhm.
off, maybe
Yeah.
gradually started to decline because it was difficult for them to keep a steady lineup. And it was for Ozzy too, but everything centered around Ozzy. But 1982, 1983, when you're talking about you're going from Blizzard of Oz, The Diary of a Madman to Bark at the Moon. I mean, Ozzy's picture was splashed all over magazines. There was almost always an article about Ozzy Osbourne. And whenever somebody reaches that level of popularity, I think there's a tighter scrutiny over that person. People start to like, I'm sick of this guy. What's so great about him? And then you start to look at him under a microscope. And I think that that's the main thing with Ozzy. I think that he's been analyzed and he has a lot of flaws. I don't think he's ever tried to deny those flaws, but when you make your persona, when you build your career off the talents of others, and that sounds kind of harsh, but if you think about it, isn't it accurate? When you do that, you draw more of a scrutiny to yourself, and I think that that's what's happened. And so now, when you're talking about Ozzy and Sabbath in the current context, and you're talking to somebody, and this is what happens more often than not that I see in online discussions and things like that. Are very quick to discredit Ozzy. They'll say he can't sing, that he's talentless, he's a hack, he owes everything to whoever. And in a lot of ways they're not wrong, but I think a lot of the intensity of that argument is brought on by the success that he's had. And it's strange that he's had so much success because he isn't a songwriter. He isn't a gifted singer in the sense where, like you said, he's not a Freddie Mercury. He's not a Ronnie James Dio, but he has a really unique and interesting voice. And it was the reason that I got turned on. It was what I liked about Black Sabbath. It's what attracted me to Black Sabbath was Ozzy's voice. So I think even though it's not on a Freddie Mercury or Ronnie James Dio or Rob Halford or Bruce Dickinson, whoever, whatever, you know, great heavy metal singer you want to throw into the mix. It's not up to that standard. It is really it's a cornerstone of heavy metal, Ozzy's voice. I mean, you talk about, his solo stuff and even Iron Man, Paranoid, Children of the Grave, all the classics. I mean, Ozzy's voice, be that what it is right up there. Um, but as far as people dogging on Ozzy, like I started to say, I see that more often, and I think it's because of where he is now, and a lot of it is, it feels like, I think people take the attitude that it's undeserved, and that overshadows Ozzy's actual what his actual merit and what his actual gifts are. And I think when you talk about Black Sabbath and Ozzy's time in Black Sabbath, what was he responsible for? Well, we're going to talk about that. But right off the bat, we know that the melodies Ozzy would bring to the table, and of course Geezer would write some lyrics, but not all the lyrics. And a lot of times, it's always credited to Geezer and the other members of the band, and I think that um, Ozzy's values sort of become convoluted as in the last 30 years. But I think when you really you get down to it, how important is Ozzy to Black Sabbath? I'd say this might be controversial, but I'd say he's essential. I say he is essential because I don't think we'd be talking about Black Sabbath right now if it wasn't for what Ozzy contributed to the band.
I
And
agree.
that's the bottom line for me.
I agree, and I'll emphasize the point too that you made up that I think what happens with Ozzy is some of the theatrical things and the controversies and the pissing on the Alamo, biting the head off of a bat and a dove, and all that kind of stuff almost takes. I mean, Ozzy has said this himself, like I don't want to die and be the guy on my gravestone that says Ozzy Osbourne, he bit the head off of a bat. And to the general public, that stuff starts to overshadow the music, and it starts to become this thing where people are like, "Oh, this guy it's just, there's nothing here. It's just all smoke and mirrors." And it's true that all through Ozzy's career during Black Sabbath, Geezer wrote the majority of the lyrics, although Ozzy did write some lyrics. We'll talk about that maybe a little later. In his solo band, Bob Daisley was the primary lyricist for a lot of that. But I'm going to give you some other examples here of people who, great singers who did not write their lyrics or all of their lyrics. How about Geddy Lee from Rush? Geddy Lee did not write the lyrics. Neil Peart did. How about Bruce Dickinson? Not only did Bruce not write a lot of Iron Maiden's lyrics and Paul Di'Anno, let's put Paul Di'Anno in there too, because Steve Harris in the early part of the band was the primary songwriter. Steve even wrote the melodies. So not only when you listen to Rhyme of the Ancient Mariner, not only did Bruce not write those lyrics, he didn't write the melody lines either. That's all Steve Harris. Robin Zander from Cheap Trick. He didn't write the lyrics. It was all what's the guitar player's name? I just forgot the guitar player in Cheap
Nielsen,
Trick.
Rick, Rick Nielsen,
Rick
Rick
Nielsen,
Nielsen.
yeah. Rick, he wrote the majority of that. And et cetera, et cetera. You can go to The Who. Pete Townsend wrote a lot of the melodies and lyrics. You could go down the list there, right? Uh, so it's not like this is some sort of bizarre, strange sort of setup where you've got a singer who doesn't write all the lyrics. But Ozzy does write the melody lines. And I say this all the time whenever somebody brings this up, when I see this on Facebook, because you're right, Darren, this comes up a lot on Facebook. Ozzy's a joke. If it wasn't for the other people in the band, Ozzy, did nothing. He doesn't contribute anything to the band, blah, 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 blah. If you haven't heard the Dave Walker version of Junior's Eyes, go and listen to that, and then listen to the Ozzy Sabbath version of Junior's Eyes, which, in my opinion, is far superior, and that will let you know what Ozzy brings to the table. It is the difference between this song I guess is okay, to this is one of my favorite Black Sabbath songs. All right.
Yeah.
And that's Ozzy's melody line. And Geezer has stated this. Darren and I were exchanging some text messages earlier in the day, and I was reading some articles, and Geezer had mentioned, and Geezer says this all the time, that Ozzy had a great knack for melody lines. And if you listen, if you buy any of the Sabbath box sets or any of the CDs that had outtakes and stuff like that, especially like from Paranoid and Master of Reality and stuff, the way they typically operated was is they'd be jamming on a riff. Ozzy would be doing sort of nonsensical lyrics. He's just sort of singing a melody line with some words blurting out here and there. But sometimes you'll hear key phrases, and Geezer has admitted this, that he'll hear a key line or something that'll spur Geezer to go off with the lyrics then and to take it from there. So you can't take away his melody line writing. The tone of his voice is very, very unique. Now, he does have a somewhat limited vocal range compared to Bruce Dickinson or Robert Plant. I would still argue that so does Jim Morrison, right? Jim Morrison doesn't have a huge vocal range either, but Jim Morrison has a unique voice just like Ozzy does. And Ozzy has, if you listen to Rob Halford when he sang with Sabbath, he struggles a little bit at times singing some of the Ozzy things. And it's not because you would say, whoa, how's that possible? Rob Halford sings into the stratosphere. Well, what it has to do with this is where the center point of Ozzy's voice sits in the vocal
Yeah.
range. It sits higher than most people's voices. So for a typical singer, it's hard to sing Ozzy stuff. It's a kind of a challenge, and he has such a unique voice that if you're going to be in a Sabbath tribute band and you're going to do Ozzy stuff, you got to really have somebody that's at least within the zip code, the ballpark of Ozzy, or it's not going to work because it's almost like tonally it's essential to the band. So, I would say with Ozzy, it's more than just writing him off as like, well, he doesn't write the lyrics. Uh, to me, that's just not fair. Frank Sinatra didn't write it. Frank Sinatra didn't write any of his songs, any of his melody lines, any of his lyrics, and everybody thinks Frank considers Frank Sinatra an amazing singer. What they would say with somebody like Frank Sinatra is he's an interpreter of songs, and I would say that Ozzy is the same way too. And my proof of that is Dave Walker's version of Junior's Eyes, which the melody line is pretty forgettable and boring, and Ozzy's version of Junior's Eyes, which in my opinion is far superior.
I don't think Ozzy ever came into a solo career thinking that he was going to be the main person. I know that he was interested in forming a band. He wanted to function in that same environment that he did with Black Sabbath. And and he did that early on. And it really wasn't his idea to take it into a namesake solo thing. I mean, he wanted to be a singer in a band. He just didn't want to be the singer in Black Sabbath anymore. And he tried it once before, and when he left, prior to I guess it was probably around '77 when he was jamming with the guys from Necromandus, and then decided that it's easier just to I'll just suck it up and go back to Sabbath. Um, but there he just wanted to do what he was good at and have the other musicians basically do what the guys in Sabbath would do.
Mhm.
And that's kind of what the Blizzard of Oz band was. He
Mhm.
had in Bob Daisley, he had a lyricist.
Like
Um,
Geezer. Yeah.
well, when he in Blizzard of Oz, when
Mhm.
and Bob Daisley was a geezer, so
Yeah.
it took the place of geezer. Randy Rhoads kind of took the place of Tony Iommi.
Yeah.
Very, uh, flashy guitar player. The guitar is like right up front. You need a prominent, important guitar player. So the crossover from Tony Iommi and Randy Rhoads kind of took that role in Blizzard of Oz. Good drummer, a guy that could write some lyrics, could maybe do a little bit of singing, backup vocals, whatever. Yeah, Lee Kerslake. So Ozzy I think he probably felt comfortable just doing what he did in Sabbath, but in another band, and that's what he did. He'd hear the band playing, he'd jump in, he'd contribute some melodies, they'd record it or whatever, or Geezer or Bob Daisley would have some ideas, and he'd pen some lyrics based around Ozzy's melodies, and that's kind of how the Blizzard of Oz started out. And as things went on and management got involved, and that's another thing I think that pulls Ozzy down is his
Yeah.
relationship with Sharon. All the things that she's done, the dirty dealings, the bad management things that she's been involved with. That he's attached to that. That pulls him down, and that's unfortunate. But I mean, ultimately, it's with his permission, I'm sure. Um, but when she became a part of this thing, then everything just kind of it changed, it shifted. Then it wasn't a band, it wasn't the Blizzard of Oz, it was
Yeah.
Ozzy Osbourne, the Ozzy Osbourne band, and then claiming songwriting credits when he didn't write all the songs, he didn't write the lyrics, he didn't write the music, but having trying to convince the people or to fool the people into thinking that Ozzy was the main person. Um, it wasn't a good idea because after people figured it out and after people started, after former members were leaving or had left and they started telling their story and word got out, then it was in all the magazines and people started to think, well, wait a minute. I thought Ozzy was the guy that wrote the music. I thought Ozzy was the guy that wrote the lyrics. Well, turns out no. And then people got kind of annoyed by that. And social media. I mean, they took it to social media, and oftentimes people feel very passionate about defending the other musicians that Ozzy or Sharon kind of screwed over. And I get it. When you're a fan of these bands and the music, you do get kind of possessive of things, and you feel like the need to defend certain players and things like that. And that's sort of where we got with Ozzy, where he was the bad guy and you wanted to root for the underdogs. You wanted to root for Lee Kerslake. You wanted to root for Bob Daisley or Jakey Lee or whoever. The guys that were in the band that got kicked out or replaced and contributed so much. And I mean, you were talking about like on the Ultimate Sin, where the Shot in the Dark was a massive hit for Ozzy. I still hear it all the time, at least once a week or more. And he didn't write the song. In fact, it was brought in by Phil Swisson, who was, in another band, and he had penned that song. But when that band broke up, he took that song with him. And then when he joined Ozzy's band, he said, "Well, here you can have this song." And then Ozzy took it, and then it became a hit for Ozzy. But you don't, the actual writers of the song don't get credit, and I think that annoys people because I think on just a fundamental level, it's like you want people to get credit for what they do. And it's a pretty simple concept. Don't take credit for somebody else's work. And I think Ozzy has taken credit for other people's work. Maybe not directly, sometimes directly with an album, in an inner sleeve credit, but I think sometimes by not saying anything or by implying that he's
Hmm.
the author, that he's the the person that did it. I think that offends people. It offends me. I mean, I don't think anybody should take credit for someone else's work or something that someone else has done. And that's another thing I think that makes Ozzy sort of the villain at times, or the person that's easy to put down and easy to want to dislike because of some of those things, those transgressions.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up the thing about Sharon and the business things because I think that that also does affect Ozzy's reputation and I think there's a little bit of jealousy too when you think about it. Quick, name a hard rock slash heavy metal singer who's had a career of 55 years that has never really been out of the spotlight for 55 years. I mean, who else, right? Robert Plant, or something. Even Robert Plant has gone in and out of his career, taken hiatuses and stuff. But Ozzy has basically had a steady career for 55 years since the first Black Sabbath record to 2025. And so I think that sometimes people sort of look at that and, hey, what did you really do to deserve this? Again, you've gotten this far off the work of other people, which again I don't think is totally fair because he is involved in the process. And as Sharon has said, even though she was sort of being cruel with this when she was referring to Bob and Lee's lawsuit against them. And I love Bob Daisley, I love Lee Kerslake, but Sharon said, if if Ozzy is so insignificant, where's your Blizzard of Oz and Diary of a Madman? How come
Right.
you haven't released, multi-platinum albums on your own, right? So there is something
Yeah.
there if you want to factor in Ozzy's image and just the entire package, the Ozzy Osbourne, as I would say by the time maybe No More Tears rolls around, Ozzy has almost become a Ozzy Incorporated. It's like become this
Yeah.
whole package. And certainly by the time Ozfest rolls around, Ozzy has become this marketable lifestyle brand or something. It's just
Yeah.
like,
Yeah.
he's created this world, if you will. And yeah, there's definitely some dirty dealings on the part of Sharon, probably. She comes across as kind of a rough business person, but you can't, I mean, who's to fault somebody for being that successful? And you don't bluff your way. This is the other thing I tell people all the time. You can't bluff your way through 55 years. I'm sorry. There's some people that have a hit somehow and they're around and everybody's talking about them for 3 or 4 years. Maybe you're able to fool the public for a certain number of years. You're riding a gimmick, you're riding some trend or something like that. You can't do that for 55 years. You can't. And Ozzy has been able to maintain this for this long. And we did our one of our more recent podcast episodes was we brought up the subject, asked the question, is Tony Iommi Black Sabbath? And I think at one point in a discussion, I mentioned that I viewed it like puzzle pieces, and the original band are four puzzle pieces. And yes, maybe Iommi's puzzle piece is a little bit bigger than the other guy's puzzle pieces, but you don't have the puzzle if you don't put all of them together. And I do believe that's true. I mean, look at Tony Iommi. Tony Iommi does not write melody lines. He has always relied on having a singer, even in his solo careers. It's Glenn Hughes or the guest vocalists that he's used over the years. Sabbath, he's always relied on the singers to deal with the singing and
Right.
the melody lines. And even though different people were involved at different points with lyrics, uh, Iommi on his own can't do it on his own. He needs somebody else. And this is very
Yeah.
common. It's very rare to have a situation like Queen, where Freddie Mercury wrote his songs, brought it to the guys. Brian May wrote his songs and sang on them and brought it to the guys. That's a rare situation. Most bands, there's at least a minimum of two guys that are interacting with each other in the songwriting, whether it's Lennon and McCartney, Jagger, Richards, Steven Tyler, Joe Perry. It's not usually the case where it's one person who's just sort of doing everything. So yeah, I can see where some of the criticism, Ozzy does get some of that criticism, and he also, I sort of view Ozzy. He's sort of like this Rocky Balboa character, right? He has this natural talent, right? And it's not that he hasn't worked at this, but maybe he hasn't worked at it the way other people have worked at it. And he just has this gift, if you will. And he's this guy that, like Rocky Balboa, he's just kind of, I've never heard Ozzy brag about his vocals. I've never heard Ozzy, he never ever comes across as being cocky or arrogant when it comes to his singing and his vocals and everything like that. He comes across as just this real lovable kind of like, hey, I'm just this guy. I've got this voice. I'm trying to do the best I can. Sometimes I sound terrible. Sometimes I sound good. I need a little help from my friends here, but hey, I'm just here to rock and roll. I want people to have fun. I want to do this for the kids. He listened to old interviews with Ozzy and he always talks about the kids and doing it for the kids in the audience.
Yeah.
And so that's the way he comes across to me. Like, I don't think he's trying to be some arrogant, like I'm the greatest singer in the world. He doesn't have that air to him at all. He has this sort of working man's Rocky Balboa thing. And that makes me want to cheer for him even more because he does have this kind of lovable, he falls on his face. He's even in his own personal life, he's been an addict. He's had life problems and stuff like that, just like a lot of
Yeah.
people do in life. But the guy just sort of picks himself up and he keeps going. And to me, that just makes him lovable to me. That makes me want to cheer him on and want him to do well. I mean, we've both talked about how we're fans of Patient Number Nine, and that was one of the things that was so exciting about that. Like, man, this is so cool that 55, or when did that album come out? 4 or 5 years ago. 50 years into his career, the guy's putting out a record where he sounds good. He sounds really good. He sounds energized. He's still here, man. And it's a cool thing. So I think he deserves more credit than he actually gets.
Yeah, I think another thing that people will often find fault with Ozzy is very well. It's been a long time since I've seen Ozzy live, but the last time I saw Ozzy live, his voice wasn't that great. The first time I saw Ozzy live, his voice wasn't that great. If we're going to go back,
Yeah.
we could basically say that in 1978, his voice
Wasn't that
was
great.
pretty bad.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, he Ozzy had his peak when he was younger, and it was around
Yeah.
74, 75, into 77. Maybe that's when it started to diminish. And ever since then, it's like it's hit or miss.
Hmm.
And I think it's pretty well known that when Ozzy's in the studio, there's well more often or more recently, it's now auto tune. But back in the day, before there was auto tune, there was a studio uh, trick technique. It was called snowflaking. And what they would do is they would put Ozzy's voice around the center, and then there'd be an octave high and an octave low, and they would blend them together. And it was almost like this nebulous sound. It wasn't really didn't have a lot of clarity to it, but because of the tone of Ozzy's voice, it would cut. And that's how Ozzy would sing in key on most of those recordings. Blizzard of Oz, Diary of a Madman, probably I don't even know what they're doing on patient number nine. Although I do appreciate the fact I am sure that it's auto tuned, but I appreciate the fact that it's not over auto tuned, where
Yeah.
it sounds like
A
Cher when
robot.
what
Yeah.
was the
Yeah.
song? Do you
Oh,
believe in
yeah.
love? When they're like, I'm glad it doesn't sound that bad.
Yeah.
Um, but it's clearly it's not Ozzy singing all not natural. It seems like he went in the studio and belted it out in one or two takes. And so, he comes under criticism for that, the quality of his voice, where you got guys like Ronnie James Dio. He's got stomach cancer and he's out there on stage, he's belting it out, and he's giving it his all, and it sounds fantastic.
Yeah.
Um, and Ozzy, there's like no excuse, just get into shape, stop doing drugs,
Yeah.
what's your problem? Why can't you sing? And that, people took scrutiny with him for that. And rightfully so. But the thing about it is that like you said, I mean, he has that lovable character about him that, he is fallible. He makes mistakes. Um, he gets up, dusts himself off, and goes back out there and does it some more. You can't help but love and people that have worked with him. You know, Bob Daisley kept coming back, and he said, "Well, you had screwed over royally the first time, and then you came back." And then you left, and then you came back again, and you came back again. Why? And they said, I like Ozzy. We make good music together. The way that we work,
Yeah.
the end result is usually something I'm proud of. And I think at that time he said, I'll probably do it again. But I think that Bob Daisley is pretty safe to say he's
Yeah.
done working
Definitely.
with Ozzy and sharing in that organization. But I mean, people seem to generally like Ozzy, like his personality. He's funny. He's a good guy. Got a good heart. Made some mistakes. Will continue to make mistakes. He's unfortunately tethered to a ruthless manager. But I mean, it is what it is. I guess that is that is Ozzy's lifeline. And if it wasn't for her and her business tactics, I mean, you can have all the talent in the world, but I think when you have those kind of personality flaws and those demons that Ozzy does, I don't think it would have ever gotten to this point without Sharon, for better or
True.
for worse. And I think also if Ozzy had if he had left the band in 1978 and he had faded into obscurity, but Black Sabbath, and you didn't hear from Ozzy again. Whatever happened to the first singer from Black Sabbath? I don't know. He's somewhere in England, or maybe they'll show a picture of him flat fat and bald like they do with like Sid Barrett or something, you know?
Yeah, yeah.
And people feel sorry for him, like, oh, and then there might be this affection toward that era. Oh, that his era was the best. Nothing compares to it. That's total Black Sabbath. That's pure. And people still will say that in spite of everything we just talked about. But can you imagine how affectionate people would be if Ozzy was that unsung hero that contributed eight albums that put this band on the map and then faded into obscurity, and other people took the gauntlet and ran with it, but never achieved the same kind of success or the same kind of iconic material that the first singer did. I think it would be a completely different dynamic, but that's not what happened. Ozzy left, had a tremendous solo career. He surpassed Black Sabbath, and then everybody started to put him under the microscope. And I think that's the crux of it. So
Yeah, I
I think
think the
that's
criticism of his live singing is very fair. As anybody who would buy an Ozzy solo live bootleg before the internet, you knew that the main concern for you when you were buying that bootleg
yeah,
was what is Ozzy
madness.
going to sound like? Because he could sound, absolutely just dreadful where he's just not singing or hitting any of the notes. So that is a fair criticism. Which sort of makes you think that is there some studio trickery going on? Is there how come this guy can sound like this on the record, but he doesn't sound like that live? And just I guess a final point I would add that you mentioned about like if Ozzy had never done anything after Black Sabbath. Well, for them to uh, release albums that could compete with that 70s era. They basically had to bring in the greatest heavy metal vocalist of all time, Ronnie James Dio, into the band in order to keep the band at that level. And you could, if you want to say Born Again too, they had to bring in Ian Gillan, one of the greatest hard rock singers of all time, in order to stay at that level. And
Yeah,
then you could say, well, most people would probably agree that the quality starts to drop after Born Again, and that's because in order for them to stay floating roughly in the proximity of where they were in the 70s,
all right.
it took the best of the best to keep them there. It wasn't enough to have. We love Tony Martin here, but he's not Ronnie James Dio. He's not Ian Gillan, and so the quality suffered a little bit
Yeah.
and
And
they couldn't quite keep the band at that same level. And that's more proof. Hey, if Ozzy is just this big clown that is, doesn't contribute anything to the band, well, how come Black Sabbath didn't keep rolling through all those records if it doesn't make any difference who's singing?
yeah,
Clearly it does, because they were only able to maintain that level of success after he left by bringing in two really, really amazing singers, the best of the best,
yeah,
Ian Gillan and Ronnie
yeah,
James Dio.
absolutely. I mean, Ian Gillan, wow. Ozzy, I mean, I know there was some animosity between him and Ronnie. And, you can understand that. I mean, Ozzy still had probably, some sentiment to being in Black Sabbath. I mean, it was a significant part of his life. That was his life. And then another guy comes in and it's like, I mean, you look at it like a divorce and, your wife gets married again. I mean, you're probably not going to be best friends with her second husband, but maybe, but it happens, but not very often. And, and these bands sort of are like marriages. And when one marriage, ends and it's still a significant part of your life. Um, so there was some animosity between Ozzy and Ronnie, but you got to look at it from his perspective. I would think that, hey, man, if you're going to replace me, I'm glad you did it with
Yeah.
Ronnie James Dio rather than some kid that showed up, uh, from some garage band and just, you let him in the band. At least it was like rock royalty. I mean, Ronnie James Dio. I mean, at that point, he's in Rainbow,
Yeah.
you know, killer material. He had a reputation. He built on that reputation after joining Black Sabbath. But I mean, if I were Ozzy, I'd be like, hey, okay, well, I mean, that's not so bad. And then after that, Ian Gillan, wow, iconic rock singer. I mean, if Ozzy was so bad, then why was it important to find singers that were of that caliber, of a higher caliber than Ozzy. So that's a question that's interesting. If he was so bad, well, then you could have just put anybody in there, right?
Yeah.
No, you couldn't, because he had value, and in order to equal that value or to increase in that value, you had to get somebody like Dio, like Gillan, um, Glenn Hughes. I mean, Seven Star, which wasn't technically a Black Sabbath album, but nevertheless, it is what it is. And you're talking about like some of the greatest voices in rock, replacing what a lot of people consider to be the worst singer in rock. You often see that. Ozzy's voice is horrible. He's one of the worst singers. Well, he's been replaced by some of the best. So that kind of stands to reason there.
Yeah, and also to the average person who doesn't follow things as closely as we do, who just listens to what they hear on classic rock radio. And we discussed this in our is Tony Iommi Black Sabbath. For a lot of people, this whoever the singer is in the band is a very, very recognizable part of the band. And when Speak of the Devil came out and Alive Evil came out basically at the same time, and I'm looking up here really quick, Speak of the Devil sits at platinum, and Live Evil, from what I can tell here, has no certification, at least in the US. It didn't reach platinum in the
Yeah.
US, from what I can tell here. So, in other words, Speak of the Devil was more successful than Live Evil was. And maybe that sort of, you can imagine that upsetting the Sabbath guys because they're like, hey, wait a minute. He's out there playing our songs and that kind of thing. And there was a little bit of that feeling, but it just goes to show that when it comes to like who people associate the songs with the most, they associate them with Ozzy. If you're just a casual classic rock radio listening fan, you associate that Ozzy's voice with Black Sabbath. So thus, when Ozzy does the Black Sabbath songs live, make Speak of the Devil, it works. Whereas we've done our podcast on Live Evil, and we talked about how it always feels a little funny listening to Ronnie sing some of those Ozzy tunes, and maybe it doesn't work quite as well. I'm sure it would sound funny with Ozzy singing Dio era Sabbath songs. That would sound weird and out of place. It wouldn't work either. And it's just, again, it's one of these things. The puzzle pieces, like I mentioned earlier, you move the pieces around, you shuffle it around. All right, well, maybe you insert Ronnie James Dio in there, and he's got a nice sized puzzle piece. But now the picture is a little different in the puzzle.
Yeah.
It's a puzzle
Yeah.
still, but now the picture has changed. And
Way to
so
describe it.
yeah, I just think that you almost you can't take Ozzy out of the equation. And here's another thing too. Think about the 70s. Who sounds like Ozzy in the 70s? You might say Robert Plant because he has a high-pitched voice, but I don't know, not really. Ozzy has a really, really unique voice for the 70s. There's like nobody. And try to put yourself in that mindset of like 1971, 1972, 1970 Paranoid album and all that stuff. And hearing a voice like that, I mean, even when I first started getting into it in 1980, when I first discovered Sabbath, I remember Ozzy's voice just like really like
Oh,
being,
yeah.
wow, this guy's voice, it jumps out
Yeah.
at you. It really stands out.
It's
It's very unique and it really sort of drew me in. I wanted to hear more of it. So he has a
like,
very, very unique voice that you could say, well, okay, he was just born with that, but yeah, so is every singer, right? To a certain degree. I mean, some people work harder at their craft than other people, but the tone
yeah.
of your voice is just something that you're sort of born with, and I guess what you do with it. But
Yeah. The self-titled Black Sabbath album wasn't the first Black Sabbath album I bought. I had already had a few under my belt before I went and found that. And I was just pretty much buying them at random or whatever would pop up at the time that I was ready to buy a Black Sabbath album. But I think that the self-titled album was maybe the third or fourth one that I got. And I was taken back by Ozzy's voice because it sounded
mm,
like he's what's the first album that he's ever sung on, and his voice is a little bit lower. And I think that he was trying to sound less. he was trying to sing in less of a higher range because I think I read somewhere that the guys weren't really, he was getting teased that he sounded like a girl. So he wanted to kind of make his voice a little bit more masculine. So he tried to pull it down, a few octaves and do that. But by the time he was singing in Paranoid, then his more natural tone started to come out and it was really good. And then it just kept building from album to album. And then by the time you get to uh, Sabbath Bloody Sabbath, and you start
Mm.
to hear when his voice is at its natural and probably at its peak. I mean, some of his melodies and just his inflections and the way that he sang is really pretty breathtaking. I mean, you talk
Mm.
about technical ecstasy and She's Gone, which you could say, well, Ozzy doesn't write the lyrics, and he didn't write the lyrics to She's Gone, but the way he sings them, I mean,
Yeah.
uh, he just owns them. He just his voice is just so emotional and it's good. And the only way I think anybody can be that good is with having natural talent and also to be really into it, like to just feel it and belt it out. And so he was that way on Technical Ecstasy. And you mentioned Junior's Eyes earlier, where you have the Dave Walker version. Dave Walker's a good singer, like the stuff he did with Savoy Brown and Fleetwood Mac's, good stuff. Um, and if I had never heard Ozzy's version of Junior's Eyes, you're right. I mean, it would be, yeah, man, it's a cool song. I like it. But then Ozzy, he just gives
Hmm.
such an emotional rendering of that song that I mean, you after you hear that, I mean, you don't even want to come anywhere near the Dave Walker version. It's like it just pales in comparison. And a lot of and Never Say Die is kind of an ill-fated album, and I'm one to say that it's of that era, it's the worst album. But when you look at it a little bit more closely, and you consider that Ozzy basically had one foot out the door, maybe almost 2 feet out the door. I mean, he did tour after it, but it was a difficult process getting that album recorded. But you listen to songs like Air Dance, Johnny
Yeah.
Blade, the title track, Junior's Eyes. He sings them all really well. I mean, it isn't
Mhm.
like he's just half-assing it. I mean, he's he's doing it. He's owning the songs. Over to You is not that great, but I mean, he's doing the best he can with it. It's just not a very exciting song. And same thing with Hard Road. He's doing the best he can with it. It's not an exciting song, but it sounds good. And Ozzy's melodies are good. The background vocals, his voice is double tracked or whatever. It all works. And Ozzy, from the first album to the last album, there's a progression in his voice, and I think he ends well. And even though, no, technically he's not the singer of the same caliber as Ronnie James Dio, he does have that special gift that he was born with, and the way that his voice sounds, that was what drew me to Black Sabbath, and it's what makes that my favorite era of Black Sabbath. I like the other eras a lot, but if somebody asks me what's your favorite era of Black Sabbath, hands down, it's the Ozzy era. I mean, that's we had the songs. There is no song that could be after Ozzy left. There is no song that I think could be a substitute for War Pigs, you know, or NIB or Paranoid or gosh, I don't know, Sabbath Bloody Sabbath. I mean, there's great songs after that, but I don't think they rise to the status of the material on some of those first 8 albums. And I think that's the main thing. And those songs, I think, were definitely made great by the way that Ozzy's voice sounds. I mean, War Pigs, the way that he just sings it, it's almost a cappella. And his voice is clear. It doesn't crack. It's just like he's just
Mhm.
and he's just going for it. There was no training. He's just going for it. And you Ronnie James Dio sang live War Pigs, and it doesn't have the same effect as Ozzy singing it. It's almost like it's kind of soul stirring when you hear Ozzy after so many times now. Not maybe not so much, but I mean the first few times I heard it, it's like, ooh, wow, that gives me the chills.
Yeah.
You know, um, Dio doesn't. He sings it well, but he doesn't sing it the same way. He doesn't have that quality that Ozzy does. That's just probably by accident, but it is what it is.
Yeah, I think that's well said. Well said. All right. Well, we'll leave it at that. Let us know in the comments down below if you think Ozzy is an underappreciated singer. Let us know what you think of some of the points that we made. Let us know in the comments down below. Make sure you check out our Black Sabbath podcast, Into the Void, a Black Sabbath podcast, and we'll see you at the next Sabbath Sunday.